The third session of the 2021 Ohio Beef Cattle Management School was hosted via Zoom by the Ohio State University Extension Beef Team on February 1st. During that third session, the focus shifted to preventing storage losses in harvested forages, analyzing harvested forage quality, and meeting the nutritional needs of the cattle being fed. To begin the first segment from that evening, OSU Extension Beef Field Specialist Garth Ruff introduces Extension Educator Ted Wiseman and his presentation on forage quality analysis and meeting the needs of the cow.
So with that, I'm going to introduce tonight's first speaker, covering how to interpret forage analysis. This is going to be Ted Wiseman. Ted's the Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator in Perry County. So with that, Ted.
Thanks for everybody for joining us tonight, but I am going to talk about sampling and analysis here this evening. So this is just a slide that's been around forever. When we make hay, mostly determined by Mother Nature, but ideally, you know, the younger that plant is, the more percentage of minerals in it, the more percentage of leaves, the more percentage of protein. And as we go through these growth stages with these plants, they'll become more mature. We'll increase the percentage of stems, increase that percentage of fiber, and increase that percentage of lignin. Lignin is that chemical, that product that gives those stems its strength, and something that we really don't want, but we kind of need it. The younger that plant is, obviously, it's going to be more digestible, going to have a higher intake, but we want to match quality with quantity. So ideally, especially on first cuttings, last year was pretty good, wasn't bad. And I'll show you some slides later, but we want to maximize that yield, but we also want to maximize that quality. So if we're going to take samples, how many do we need to take? Where do we take them? You know, is it a single cutting, a single field? It depends on, you know, your operation, whether you're selling hay or whether you're buying hay. I wouldn't do either unless I had a forage sample. But normally we want to try to keep that under 200 tons. We shouldn't mix cuttings or mix fields or mix hay types just because it's going to bias those samples. Ideally, we want to take these right before we would feed them. However, you know, a lot of us bale round bales. Some of us have these big square bales. But a lot of producers here in my area will bale the round bales and they'll leave them sit outside for about 3 weeks, let them go through that sweat before they put them in the barn. And then it's tough to get that forage sample when you have them in storage, depending on your storage facility. So, you know, at minimum, you'd want to take those samples before you put them in the barn when you can get to them easy enough. But those samples, normally you'll get them back in about a week or 2 weeks. But you just want to make sure you give that sample with those forages time to go through that sweat, let them get stabilized, you know, 10 to 15% moisture content or 85 to 90% dry matter, however you want to look at that. This is a pretty good website here if you want to go to it. It's foragetestingorg. This is what a lot of these forage labs subscribe to. It'll tell you how samples are done and all those kinds of things. But what I did at this sample is I pulled up different types of hay probes. And they have a listing there of a whole different type, some of them that I didn't know was out there. But you can go down to a 3/8 of an inch hay probe in diameter. I would rather go to something more of around a 3/4 with the forage species that we have in our areas across the state. I think it'd give you a better representation of that sample that you've got. But you can get probes that are serrated, scalloped, or straight edge, and I'll show you here an example in the next slide. Something about 14 to 24 inches. Pretty good idea to have something that you can replace that tip because they do get dull. And on average, you know, 20 samples is what they recommend. I don't know too many people that are going to go to that effort. But if, you know, the more accurate you want to be, the more samples you take. But about a half a pound of that sample will be adequate. Here's just 3 types here. This top one is the smooth edge. Probably be easier to sharpen than these other 2. The middle one there, you can see the little Allen screw that you can replace that tip. This is kind of the design that I have in our office. And then the lower one, I think this one screws in, but they will get dull. You can see the top one's got this canister that the forage can go into. This middle one, once you push that into a bale, you got to pop that off of there, and then take a dowel rod and shove it into a bag or a bucket. A little bit cumbersome. But they work. And these are the ones I took from that website. All kinds of different prices. The top left here, this plastic cup, you just put a Ziploc bag on it and you just keep going. And then that last sample, you'll have to take this rod that they sell with it and shove it through there to get all that sample into that bag. This bottom one, that's that smaller diameter one. I would caution purchasing something like this because I think when you'd shove that into a bale, you may not get all the stem that you would have in that sample, or could be. This top middle one, it's got a canister on the back of it. You just use that as a handle to twist it into the bale. Probably be a little slower than some of these others. This Oakfield Open Designs just got an open hole in it where you could just hold it over a bucket or a bag to fill it in. And then if you have silage or baleage, this bottom one here, this silage probe, if you got a bunker type or a bag type, you could get a pretty good size sample out of that with that one. But there you can see they're pretty proud of that price. That's a $1,200 probe right there. So you can spend as much or as little as you want to on them, but check with your extension office. A lot of us have probes in our office. Mine tends to wander around the county, and I don't even know who has it, but they know where, my producers know where it is more than I do, but that's great that it's out and being used. So you want to make sure that you're random. Be honest to yourself and to your cows, okay? Square bales, about 20 cores. Round bales, you can take 2 from each bale if you want to. Take a representation of the whole stack. Don't bias your samples. Again, be honest to yourself. Don't avoid anything just because it looks bad. Just, you know, if you got 25% of them that are good, 25% of them are bad, and half of them are average, take your samples accordingly to that. Where do you take the sample makes a difference. Square bales, like this large square here, you want to go from the ends. Same with small squares. That way you're getting a larger representation of that swath. If you go from this other side here, you're just going to get a small narrow area of that field, and it's going to bias your sample. Round bales, you want to take them from the side, okay? And normally when I take mine, because I don't have the ability to store mine yet, I should have them undercover, but I don't. But I'll angle that up a little bit from the side of that bale just because they're sitting outside and kind of prevent water from going and getting into that bale. If you're going to use an electric drill, 18 volts minimum, make sure you got a couple batteries with you and able to charge them, because especially if that tip's getting dull, it's going to work your drill a little bit. If the kids are driving you nuts, put a bracing bit on it, turn them loose. It'll keep them out of your hair for a couple hours and let them go take the samples for you. You don't want to send in a flake or a grab sample because it's going to bias that sample, and normally it's going to underestimate it, okay? Unless you deliberately just grab the leaves off of alfalfa, you might do it that way. But the way you take these, this is that probe that has where you can attach that bag to it. Just combine all those cores, okay? Whether you're putting them into a bag or putting them into a bucket, but combine them all. But even if you're putting them in a bag, I would still dump them into a bucket, mix them in that bucket, and then dump it out on the table. Because if you just reached in there and grabbed a handful out of that bag or out of that bucket, the most nutrient dense part of that plant is going to be the leaves. And all those fines are going to be at the bottom of that bag or at the bottom of that bucket. So put them in that bucket, mix them up, dump them on a table, and then quarter them out to the size that you need. If you took 20 samples and you still have too much, take that 1/4 out and then put that 1/4 back in a bucket, mix it up, dump it on the table again, and then take you another 1/4 till you get the size that you need to send into the lab. You don't want to send them in a gallon bag full of forages because they're not going to take the time to mix it up real good and sort it for you. They're just going to grab a sample and take it. But seal them in a bag. You want to mail them early in the week. For dry hay, not so much of an issue, but if you got haylage or silage or baleage that's got high moisture content, yeah, but I would still, either way, send them in early in the week so the lab gets them. They're not sitting somewhere over the weekend. You know, don't leave it on the dash of your truck for a week. Expose it to sun. Dry samples, you don't need to refrigerate them. But again, if you're taking haylage or silage, yeah, you want to seal them. If you can vacuum seal them, that's even better. So the air can't get to them and they're not going to decompose a little bit on you. But get them there as quick as you can. What lab do you use? Doesn't make any difference. They're all accredited labs for forages or soils. They're all accredited labs. But the techniques they use, you want to be aware of that. There's 2 different techniques out there. There's wet chemistry or near infrared. You want to make sure you know which one they're using. They both will work. Wet chemistry is a little more accurate. Okay, near infrared works well if you just got a single species. So if you just have alfalfa or just orchard grass, you're in good shape. But just know, be aware of what technique they're using. What nutrients are you needing? A lot of guys just want to see protein, but there's a lot more valuable information you can get from a forage sample than just proteins. And we'll kind of cover that a little bit. Then another quality factor that you'll see on some these forage samples, it'll either give you a number for relative feed value or relative feed quality. Relative feed value has been around for years. For grass samples, that relative feed value, and here what I have in wording, is based on alfalfa, and will discriminate against samples with NDF, or mostly grass samples. Okay, is more, we have learned that while grasses have higher NDF, it is more digestible, and therefore RFQ is a better estimate. This was developed by the University of Wisconsin, and if you get online, there's a real nice fact sheet out there that differentiates between the two. Not knocking either one of them, okay? But just be aware that if you've got a lot of grass in your sample and you're just looking at RFV values, it will discriminate them against them a little bit. So the RFQ is a little better. A lot of our dairy guys have went to using this just because they want a more detailed and more accurate digestibility number. Just an example here, I pulled off a website for one of the companies in Ohio that does these. Different results that you can get have different prices. This top one's $47. This is from last year. I don't know whether it's changed for this year or not. But for another $3, you can get that relative feed value. All right. If you just want moisture and dry matter, you can do that yourself. But when I do a forage sample, I want to know my protein, my total digestible nutrient, and I want to know the minerals as well. It's nice to know what you're feeding your cow, number one, but then number two, you know how much minerals you're pulling off of that field. We take more phosphorus and potassium off our forage fields than we do our corn or soybean or wheat fields. All right. So knowing what you're pulling off, what you need to replace, just as important as what you're feeding to that animal and whether you need to make up any deficiencies that you have. But other optional testings, you can add ash, sulfur, lignin. If you have some horses, different digestive system, different TDN calculation that they use for those. Horses and rabbits, they have the same digestive system. Of course, you put horse on any product and they're going to charge you more for it. So it is a little more expensive, but if you got ruminants, if you want the whole 9 yards done, there's the cost for that. Okay. Again, you can get into more detailed nitrates. I'll talk a little bit about that later. In drought years, that can be important. If you want to know crude fat, starch, sugars, some of our dairy folks want some pretty detailed results. Selenium, back in the day, used to be a bigger issue. Now we do some vitamin supplementation, including selenium in it, or we can actually inject selenium into some of our newborns to alleviate some of those issues. But if you do have a concern with it, you're able to get that results as well. So when you get your results, what are you looking for? Again, I'll show you 3 different companies here, the way their results are, but the only time you want to look at that, in my opinion, is if you're, just so you know what your moisture content and your dry matter content is, okay? For hay, we want them between 10 and 13, 18 to 20%. You know, we could have some possible heating or molding. We get above that. Silage or baleage, a little wetter. They're sealed, you know, a little bit higher with that moisture content. But if I'm comparing nutrients, I want to compare dry matter on a dry matter basis. Okay. So you want to use that column when you're looking at the nutrients when you get your analysis back. So some of the things are going to be on here. Number one is your crude protein. That's what a lot of producers look at, that number. There's a lot more things that we want to look at when we get these samples back. But the lower the crude protein value, that's probably a more mature forage. Very immature, you know, we could be up to 26%, but again, our yield's not going to be as much. But some labs can test for that available protein. If you ever had a square bale or a round bale or any type of hay that turned brown, it didn't mold, but turned brown, that was from heat being a little bit too high in moisture. That's caused by a Maillard reaction. Cows love it, but that protein is unavailable to that animal. Okay. Couple other numbers we want to look at is our ADF, our acid detergent fiber, and our neutral detergent fiber. We want these numbers to be as low as we can get them. Our acid detergent fiber will give us our more energy, our higher digestibility. Legumes are going to be a little better than grasses. And then for our NDF, we want that lower fiber content, which will give us a higher animal intake. And I put this in small letters here for manure pile. You can tell the digestibility of your forages looking at the manure pile from your cattle. What's the manure piles look like when they're on pasture in the summer? They're flat, they're liquidy, okay? What about in the wintertime? Do they look like a ball cap that you just threw it on the ground? That's an indication of lower digestibility and higher fiber content. So you can tell, you can't give a number to it, but you can tell how digestible your forages are by looking at the manure piles. TDN, this is a number that I really look at when I get my forage samples back. We want a pretty high TDN sample, and I'll admit this is from one of my forage samples in 2019 when it was so crappy in the spring. Not real good, okay? Legumes, we want it to be 50s or in the 60s. Grasses, 50s or better. Then a relative feed value number, it's just a number, but a number of about 100 with an RFE, think of that as a mid to late bloom alfalfa, okay, would be 100. For grasses, we want it 100 or plus. We can get to 80 to 90, but 80 below 80 just probably isn't going to have enough energy or enough gas in it to keep the girls going. Nitrates, a lot of us normally don't check nitrates. You may want to check the nitrates if you put on some urea or some nitrogen on your fields and maybe you got a little too much on there and could be a concern when you make that next cutting. But a lot of nitrate problems show up in a drought year, especially if you're making silage. We've got some fact sheets to tell you how to take that sample. We take it from a specific area of that stock, that corn stalk, but there's the limit values on that. But if you think you're getting into trouble with that, work with your nutritionist because you can really mess them up if you don't have those at the right levels. Okay, just another lab's results here. Again, showing you as dry matter here as is, and then this lab will give you a typical range, okay? And here we've got the minerals here. Here's a TDN. It's a little better sample than mine that was in the last sample. But they give you the crude protein available and then the adjusted crude protein, okay? Ash. Ash is something that we normally don't look too much at. But for alfalfa, we want something around an 8%, and grass is about a 6%. This table here just shows a study that they did out in Wisconsin a few years back. The average for the haylage samples that they had was 12.3. The max was 18, minimum of 5.7. For hay, the average was 10.3 maximum, almost 18 again, and a minimum of about 9. If you've got that high of an ash sample in your forages or your haylage, if it's 18%, about a pound, you're feeding about a pound of dirt with every 5 pound of haylage or hay you're giving them. And we've really gotten into some trouble with this. If you're planting some cover crops or some annuals and you're putting them in with a drill, we're going to get higher ash content. Wheel rakes have become more popular. Those wheels are riding right on top of the ground, picking up a little bit of dirt. And disc mowers. When disc mowers first come out, guys wanted to tilt those blades right at the top of the ground to get as much as they could. You're hitting mud clods, putting more ash in it. And also when you got those blades set that low, we had several producers that killed their orchard grass because the growing point of orchard grass is 2 inches above the ground. So set them about 3 inches and you'd be a lot better. Just another lab here that gives a way more detail. I'm not going to cover all of this, but again, here they're giving some of the amino acids, some of the volatile fatty acids over here, pretty detailed. This is what a lot of our dairy producers would want to look at, but they give you the minerals. Nice thing about this lab is they give you the RFE and RFQ. And there you can see that in this sample, the RFQ is a little bit lower than the RFQ. But then they also have a 60-day running average and a 4-year running average, just so you can see where you're at. How they calculate that is dependent on what you would ask for, whether you're wanting some dairy recommendations, or for the beef, this NRC, these are the Nutritional Bibles. There is hundreds and hundreds of studies that have went in to write each chapter of these books. They have just a chapter on vitamins, just one on minerals, and etc. But all the data collected from universities across the country. About every 10 years, they try to rewrite these. They're pretty pricey books. I've got an old beef one. I don't have the newer version yet, but just be aware that these recommendations, there's a lot of science behind that, is where they come up with these recommendations. So just be aware that that's out there. These are just some tables that I put together. I picked these numbers at random, okay? I picked these TDN levels and then crude protein levels associated with each of them. So this is just a 1,200 pound cow. That's what everybody's beef cows weigh, right? We don't have no 14 or 15 or 1,600 pound cows running out there. But if we took that crappy sample that I had 2 years ago, it was 0.38% TDN. We'll say it had 6% crude protein. If I'm feeding that cow 22 and a half pounds of hay, I would need to also feed that animal almost 5 pounds of corn and almost a half a pound of soybean meal just to meet her maintenance requirements. All right. We get to calving, her TDN requirements go up to 54. These are in percentages, these are whole numbers. So again, if we had that same hay sample at 38 TDN, 6% crude protein, we're giving her 18 pounds of hay, we'd have to bump that corn up to 7 pounds and add another pound to a pound and a half of soybean meal just to meet her maintenance requirements. So what happens if we get to peak milk production? It really goes up. 15 pound of hay, we'd have to take corn up to 10 pounds and still a pound and a half of soybean meal. If we weren't at 60, for a TDN, that's the only hay sample that would meet, and had 10% crude protein, that's the only sample that would meet that animal's requirement. And what happened in 2019? This is a slide. Several of my coworkers sent me forage analysis that they received. These are TDNs. I just ranked them in order. Now, some of these would meet that 49 and 54 TDN, right? But how many of them met that peak milk production in 2019? And I know Stan Smith's on the line, and he was telling me that he had some folks telling him that ODA posted 6 cows that starved to death that winter. The producers said there's no way. They had round bales in front of them all winter long. This is how that happened. They weren't getting enough energy. And then this line here is the protein values. Even though we may have some adequate TDNs, we still want to look at the protein. This sample here, this is a second cutting. TDN isn't bad on this one. Protein's kind of marginal. It's still above 8, but some of these over here, you want to look at both of them. So does a year make a difference? These are samples from last year. Now, these aren't the same farms, not the same fields, not the same whatever. They're just random samples. But last year spring was a little better, right? We can see a few more of these samples will meet that at peak milk production. We only got 2 here that wouldn't be good enough for the last trimester or at calving, but the rest of them aren't bad, okay? Better spring. But boy, look at this sample. It's not bad on TDN. But the protein is way low on that. So it's still, just to emphasize that we need to sample our forages. And then here's second cutting. Again, just because it's second cutting, these 3 here still have some work to be done. And then even third cutting out here. These first 2, still the TDN isn't good. So just because it's third cutting, we always think it's better. First fed or first baled, first fed. If we're not analyzing those forages, we still could be getting into some trouble. And then looking at the minerals, this is where you really want to work with your nutritionists. I just throw this slide up there just because there are a lot of interaction and antagonisms with, if you get one out of whack, it could screw up another one. I mean, with phosphorus, it'll affect zinc, molybdenum, manganese, and calcium. So, just be aware of that and work with them. If you see some extremely high numbers or extremely low numbers, work with your nutritionist to get those diets balanced in your mineral program where it needs to be. And I'll just finish up with this one, Garth. I always like this saying from Justin Sexton, that anyone who's not soil testing or forage testing still doesn't think fertilizer and hay prices are high enough yet. So with that,